Good morning. My name is Douglas Thompson. I am the director of the Spencer B. King Jr. Center for Southern Studies, who host the Lamar Memorial Lecture Series. I am also a professor of history in our history department here at Mercer University. The center's primary purpose is to examine the region's complex history and culture through courses, conversations, and events that are open, honest, and accessible. On behalf of the King Center, I would like to welcome you to the first lecture in this year's Lamar Memorial Lecture Series. For more than 60 years, the Lamar Lecture Committee, due to a generous gift by Eugenia Dorothy Blunt Lamar, has been able to bring to Mercer's campus some of the leading scholars of Southern history, literature, and culture. This year's speaker adds to that important list of scholars. Dr. William Fitzhugh Brundage has taught at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill since 2002 and is the William Umstead Distinguished Professor in the History Department. He received his BA from the University of Chicago and his Master's of Arts and his PhD in history from Harvard University in modern American history. His publications are numerous, and so I'm not going to list them all, but the two books that are outstanding for us and this particular work that we are interested in are A Socialist Utopia in the New South, The Ruskin Colonies in Tennessee and Georgia from 1894 to 1901, published by the University of Georgia Press in 1996, which was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Book of the Year for 1997. And Lynching in the New South, Georgia and Virginia, 1880 to 1930, University of Illinois Press, published in 1993. As a quick aside, I met Fitz at the Library of Virginia while he was doing some research, and I was beginning a dissertation on Richmond, and he was kind and gracious. He will not remember that we had lunch together, but I remember being floored that somebody who could write such an outstanding book like Lynching in the New South would pay attention to a grad student. He has been that gracious ever since. The Lamar Lectures titled, his Lamar Lectures titled The Prisoner of War Experience in the American Civil War, grows out of research regarding the use of torture in America's experiences of war. The lectures explore the nature of imprisonment, both encampments and in constant motion, and the effect of these experiences had on soldiers' lives. This morning's lecture opens with the three-lecture series. We will have lecture 2, titled Living an Enclosed Life, Prisoners of War in Place at 6 p.m. this evening in this room. And then tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. We will have the third and final lecture, Coerced Movement, Prisoners of War in Motion. All of them will be streamed at kingcenter.mercer.edu, so you can catch them if you are not in this room for those other two lectures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brundage to Macon and to Mercer University.
Well, it's a distinct pleasure for me and a distinct honor for me to be here. I certainly want to thank Doug, who has always been gracious from that very first time that I met him to the present day. I also want to thank David Davis, and I want to thank Sarah Gardner, who both now and in the past have always been wonderful colleagues, peers, and friends. Thinking about how to open this, Doug mentioned that work is a rather surprising topic for me in some ways. I arrived at this topic growing out of my most recent book project, which was a history of torture in the United States called Civilizing Torture, an American Tradition. And one of the chapters in that book is devoted to the issue of torture and cruelty during the American Civil War. And it was while I was working at the very end of that book that Sarah mentioned to me the Lamar Lectures. And there was that chapter didn't leave me satisfied. There was more I wanted to say. And so I want to thank Sarah's for provoking me, so to speak, to extend my ideas, and in the process, It has led me to my current book project. So you're going to be hearing an early distillation of some ideas that I'm working through right now. I think the first lecture is how would I put this? It gives you a taste. The second lecture may be the grimmest of them, and the third lecture, I hope, lightens the atmosphere a little bit. But in any case, let me get underway. I will say, to the extent I'm going to mention a lot of people who are not big names, they're not probably familiar to most of you, or perhaps any of you. And so to the extent possible, I have tried to identify them with photographs. So let me start with my first image. In January 1862, Colonel John Pegram, CSA, surrendered to the dictates of a portrait photographer. Careful staging presented him so that none could reproach him. Wearing his double-breasted gray frock coat and buttoned black gloves, Pegram leaned with his right forearm and against a shoulder-high column. His hair was meticulously parted, his mustache and beard carefully groomed. He stared into the camera lens, his stance at ease, yet hinting a latent dynamism. Together with his immaculate uniform and his resolute gaze, his posture conveys confidence, self-sufficiency, and distinction. And then, as you can see, there's the pillar prop and the artfully draped curtain on his right, replicating the visual vocabulary of 19th century portrait art, bestowing a measure of grandeur on the scene. In this instance, the portrait signaled that Pegram had the self-mastery to exercise authority over men and to compel their subordination. There's no hint of disgrace, no hint of defeat in this portrait. But this is an image of a prisoner of war. Pegram had been prisoner for 6 months when David Ben Dan, the most prestigious photographer in Baltimore, made this portrait. Little of the confidence that's displayed in this portrait studio had been evident the previous July 61, when Pegram suffered the unenviable distinction of being one of the first Confederate officers to surrender. His subsequent 9 months of captivity, from July 1861 to April 1862, would have been unrecognizable to tens of thousands of men who filled the prison pens, the Civil War prison pens, a year later. At no time during his imprisonment did Pegram endure the dehumanization that characterized the subsequent handling of prisoners. Instead, he passed through the crucible of captivity with his pride undiminished, his appetite sated, as you'll hear, and his dress uniform spotless. Likewise, nothing in this often reproduced photograph by the famed Civil War photographer Matthew Brady portends the Civil War prisoner of war camp experience of the Confederate captives who went to Point Lookout, Elmira, and other camps in the North. This image depicts 3 Confederates captured on the Gettysburg battlefield in July of 1863. The image likely attained fame because it was very deftly composed and is expertly exposed. I mean, for 19th century photography, that is an extraordinary photograph. The enduring popularity of the photograph also lies in the image it presents of the captives. If you looked at that image, if you did not know that was prisoners of war, you would assume those are just soldiers. Well, they are soldiers, but they're captive soldiers. The popularity of the photograph, as I said, lies in the image it presents. The men appear at the moment to be in a moment of respite during a march or a battlefield maneuver. Aside from the fact that they are unarmed, there are no signs that these men are prisoners. They appear battle-weary, but they display neither fear nor submission. They're not rendered as, they are, I should say, rendered as unbowed soldiers, populating the photograph as distinct individuals. If you notice, each assumes his own stance and focuses his gaze in a different direction. They're not standing in a lineup of prisoners. An altogether different prisoner of war experience is revealed in this photograph of more than a dozen men standing in an earthen pit at Andersonville Prison. This photograph is taken you can see the date actually. This photograph was taken 2.5 years after the portrait of Pegram and 13 months after Brady's photograph. It's not a portrait of a man or a study of a few individuals. Rather, it's a grim rendering of a mass grave and the men who have dug it. In it, a squad of anonymous prisoners assigned to burial duty paused during their Sisyphus-like task of filling the massive trench with more than 100 prisoners, 100 corpses, I should say, that had accumulated since the previous day. Each day, several times a day, wagons loaded with 20 to 30 bodies at a time transported the dead from the prison hospital to the burial grounds. As this photograph recorded, the burial squad lowered the corpses in a trench and buried them under dirt, usually without any covering. The location of each body was marked with a stake at the head, identifying the soldier and his date of death. With the banks of removed earth framing each side of the photograph, the photographer placed in the center 2 men preparing to entomb the body of Leander Farnham, who had died that morning of severe malnutrition. His grave number was 5851, 5,851. There would be another 8,000 more corpses eventually added beside his in the burial grounds of Andersonville. Here was a stark image of the wholesale and merciless human devastation wrought by the American Civil War. Now I have to do a little bit of that academic historian throat clearing where we talk about what have people said about this in the past, and I'll try to do that concisely. Historian James McPherson, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning Battle Cry of Freedom, lamented, quote, "Civil War prisons and the prisoner exchange question badly need a modern historian." Now he wrote that, I think that came out in 1988. Given the scale of the prisoner of war camps that I'm going to be talking about, given the number of men who experienced them, it may appear puzzling that at least at the close of the 20th century, prison pens were chronically understudied. To the extent that any Americans had pondered the camps, most have done so in a manner that impedes consideration of their largest significance. Attention has focused almost exclusively on the conditions that prisoners endured in the individual camps. This orientation is partially explained by the record of the camps produced by the ex-prisoners themselves. That's just a sampling. There are literally hundreds and hundreds. Well, I shouldn't say hundreds and hundreds. I should say tens and tens. There are probably close to 200 prisoner memoirs. Prisoners recalled witnessing fellow inmates choking down inedible foods, improvising inadequate shelter, avoiding poorly equipped and ineptly staffed hospitals, and sparring with cruel and capricious guards. Some of the prisoners' harrowing memoirs sold well and went through multiple print runs. But by the turn of the 20th century, this literature was out of step with the spirit of national reconciliation. Increasingly, such accounts were dismissed as artifacts of wartime propaganda and regrettable, if understandable, personal bitterness. So champions of reconciliation dismissed their contemporaries who continued to stir up wartime animosities as retrograde sectionalists, crass demagogues, special pleaders, and hucksters desperate for recognition. Nearly 3/4 of a century after the war, William Hesseltine, historian, published the first major study of civil wars. It was called Civil War Prisons, a study in war psychology, published in 1930. More than 3/4 of a century later, his book remains the most widely consulted work on Civil War prisons. Indeed, it was the one book that James McPherson, who I mentioned earlier, recommended that readers read if they were interested in Civil War prisons. Heseltine played an oversized, arguably crucial role in explaining the Civil War prison pens as a tragic outcome of naive military officials and inept politicians overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. His professed devotion to objectivity and insistence on the supremacy of certain forms of evidence led him to dismiss the accounts of prisoners of war, veterans, and wartime observers as biased, lurid, and unreliable. Above all, he rejected any suggestion that prisoners' suffering was by design. Heseltine's book has remained influential because it was an argument consonant with Americans' romantic views of the Civil War. But it was also has remained influential because Heseltine himself tenaciously defended his interpretation until his death in 1963. When novelist McKinley Cantor published his Pulitzer-winning novel, Andersonville, in 1955, he explicitly drew comparisons between the notorious prison camp of Andersonville and the death camps of World War II, which were, of course, recent memory for his generation. Heseltine took umbrage. Wrapping himself in the shroud of scientific objectivity, he disparaged Cantor's novel as bad fiction and, even worse, history. Cantor's greatest offense in Heseltine's eyes was to suggest that the suffering in the Georgia prison pen was a result of clear intent. Neither Heseltine nor anyone else in the academy at that time would countenance such a claim. Not until the close of the 20th century did Heseltine's grip loosen and historians begin to advance arguments akin to those of Cantor. A few historians have contended that cruelty and deprivation borne by the prisoners of war were the result of deliberate war policies. According, for example, to Lonnie Spear, conditions in the camp were so bad that, quote, to have been killed on the battlefield might have been more humane, end of quote. Union and Confederate authorities knowingly ignored the conditions in the prison pens. Charles Sanders contends because debilitated prisoners would be rendered unfit for any future military service. These and other recent works have yet to dislodge Heseltine's study, however. To a great degree, they remain tethered to the questions that Heseltine raised, and they differ only in that they turn Heseltine's conclusions on their head. With their tight focus on assigning responsibility for camp conditions, these recent books remain mute about the larger significance of the Civil War prisoner of war experience. There are two notable exceptions I want to note here. One on the left by Benjamin Cloyd, and the one on the right by Evan Kutzler. In Haunted by Atrocity, Cloyd reorients our focus by tracing Americans' ongoing and willful national amnesia regarding Civil War prison camps. His careful and compelling account makes clear the discomfort that successive generations of Americans have felt about the implications of the wartime prison pens. In Living by Inches, Kutzler offers a granular inventory of the sensory experiences of imprisonment during the Civil War. In lapidary prose, he foregrounds the lived experience of the prisoners and brings us closer to an understanding of prison life than any previous author. So as Americans, we are fond of affirming that the Civil War was the first modern war, the first total war, the first technological war. On the battlefields of Antietam and Franklin, along the trenches surrounding Petersburg, across the border regions convulsed by guerrilla violence, and in the prison camps of the Confederacy and the Union, Americans gained an unwelcome familiarity with the intensity and devastation of modern war. Often less acknowledged facet of this modern warfare was the unprecedented number of prisoners. Surrender and captivity took place on an enormous scale during the American Civil War. Roughly 2 million Northerners took up arms, and nearly 900,000 Southerners took up arms. So we'll just round that off to 3 million men in uniform during the Civil War. Of those 3 million men, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 Union soldiers and 450,000 Confederates surrendered by the end of the conflict. A total roughly equivalent to the number of soldiers who were killed during the Civil War. And for tens and tens and tens of thousands of those Union soldiers, and even more of the Confederate soldiers, surrender was followed by extended captivity in the prison camps. My point would be that not all prisoners of war, or not all captives during the Civil War, ended up being prisoners of war in the camps for a long period of time. But those who were in the camps tended to be there a long time. From the vantage point of the 21st century, prisoner of war camps may appear to be an innate feature of war. Since ancient times, some system of handling the enemy, captives, has been a practical necessity in most military endeavors. In the modern era, every major conflict, I have the Boer War there, World War I, World War II, the Korean War had prison camps, on and on. Every major conflict since the Civil War has generated large numbers of prisoners who have endured custodial incarceration for extended periods of time. But to assume that the prisoner of war camps are an inevitable fact of war is to overlook the innovation that the Civil War prison pens represented. Custodial prisons on the scale of the Civil War camps were not a product of gradual evolution. Instead, they emerged abruptly and with few immediate antecedents. Caught off guard by the severity of the war, wartime civilian and military leaders concluded that custodial imprisonment on a massive scale was both feasible and necessary. And the prison pens they created were a milestone in Americans' capacity to dehumanize fellow humans, to reduce humans to numerical objects who could be managed. The capacity of Civil War captors to reduce their charges to mere objects was greatly facilitated by the distinctive character of the prisoner of war camps they pioneered. As the war dragged on, prison authorities tightly administered the camps while cutting them off from the surrounding communities. By design, they rendered inmates utterly dependent on their captors for survival. As more and more Civil War prisoners became charges of their captors, they became things, and they became dispendable. Treatment that otherwise would have been unimaginable became commonplace, even justifiable. Civil War prison camps remain one of the largest experiments in closed total institutions in American history. So this is the floor, this is the map of Elmira, a Union in New York, a Union prisoner of war camp for Confederates. Only the massive and systematic surge of criminal incarceration during the past half century exceeds the scale of the Civil War prison pens. So in other words, during the Civil War in 1863, just making a rough guesstimate here, there are about 225,000 prisoners of war in camps in 1863, 1864. You'll see, I don't have statistics before 1920, but you'll see that's roughly the prison population of the entire United States until probably about 1950. And it's only in 1970 that we probably exceeded the custodial prison population of the Civil War. And of course now it's a whole nother story. But I just want to put this in a larger perspective so you can see how unprecedented what happened in the Civil War was. The phenomenon of objectification and dehumanization was not an innovation of the Civil War generation. That's not my claim. Armies since the early modern era had assigned soldiers into ranks, categories, and units in order to transform a heterogeneous crowd of individuals into a tractable and orderly army. And more recently, the banal objectification of students was manifest in the dog tags that soldiers during World War II wore as a means of identification. And for 2 centuries before the firing on Fort Sumter, enslaved African Americans had been targets of dehumanization. The ongoing dehumanization of the enslaved, however, was different in crucial regard from that of prisoners of war. It was both the cause and consequences of individuals and institutions alike engaging in an ongoing and vast system of labor and markets. The government was deeply implicated in slavery, but the day-to-day exercise of the slaveholders' power was not a direct expression of state power. To the contrary, slave owners deprived the state of power, so their authority over their enslaved property was almost unfettered. In contrast to the enslaved, prisoners in Civil War camps experienced direct objectification and dehumanization at the hands of the enemy state. The men who entered the Civil War prison pens confronted a form of state power that was wholly outside their experience. Most antebellum Americans had only sporadic contact, if any, with the federal government. Almost none had experienced its punitive fist. In 1860, the federal census counted just over 19,000 prisoners, criminal prisoners, incarcerated in state facilities across the entire nation. None of the largest penitentiaries, there we have, that's Auburn at the top, Eastern State over here on this side, and down there is the Charleston State Prison in Boston. None of the largest penitentiaries in the United States in 1860 held as many as 1,000 prisoners. Point Lookout, this is, sometimes I may call it Point Lookout. Point Lookout was the whole area, but Camp Lookout is really what I'm referring to, which is up there at the top. You can see a square. I'll show you enlargement later. Point Lookout, where Camp Lookout was located, a Union prisoner of war camp on the Maryland Peninsula, jutting into the Chesapeake Bay, illustrates the magnitude of the innovation that Civil War prison camps represented. In 1860, the overwhelming majority of Americans lived in rural counties. A population of 10,000 was sufficient to elevate a community into the ranks of the nation's 100 largest communities. In 1865, this camp held nearly 20,000 captives. The camp housed as many prisoners as all of America's prisons in 1860 had housed, prisons and jails. Indeed, its population was 20 times greater than the largest pre-war prison. Had it never held more than its planned maximum of 10,000 prisoners, it would have represented a significant milestone in the nation's history. To conceive of a prison camp on the scale of Point Lookout, let alone on the size of Andersonville, required audacity and imagination. To envision building any one of the larger Union or Confederate camps was to create an impromptu fortified city, with the additional complications of supplying and securing a dependent and hostile population. Certainly no officers in either army had any experiences that easily translated to managing tens of thousands of prisoners. In 1860, the entire U.S. Army total numbered less than 20,000. So in 1865, there were more prisoners in Camp Lookout than there had been soldiers in the U.S. Army 5 years before. Few experiences during the war were more terrifying than the transition from warrior to captor. Formal surrenders of large numbers of Confederate and Union soldiers, such as the capture at the conclusion of the siege of Vicksburg in 1865, account for roughly half of the surrenders during the war. The remainder took place during or after battles when individual soldiers surrendered. The often complex circumstances, motivations, and consequences of these surrenders cannot easily be squared with the romantic image of the Civil War. Some combatants surrendered at the first convenient opportunity to escape battle. Others surrendered when caught off guard or in embarrassing circumstances. And others surrendered to avoid threatened annihilation by the enemy if they did not. Whatever the circumstances, the transition from combatant to vulnerable prisoner was traumatic and elicited powerful emotions. One Illinois soldier put it, quote, "I cannot describe the state of my mind just then, but I guess I felt like that boy after getting a good whipping, which he did not deserve, very despondent," end of quote. Not until hours after his capture did William Hague, and I should warn you that I'm going to talk about William Hague many times to come. But not in any case, not until hours after his capture did William Hague begin to sense what it meant to be a prisoner of war. On January 15th, 1865, he and others who had defended Fort Fisher in North Carolina against an amphibious Union assault were finally overwhelmed. Their captors then marched him and the other prisoners about 4 miles north towards Wilmington, where the procession halted and Hague and the other exhausted Confederates collapsed on the frozen beach. When sentinels took up posts surrounding them, Hague experienced, quote, "that first conscious," and he underlined the word conscious, "knowledge of being a prisoner." Hague and other men swept into the Civil War prison pens shared the conviction that they were passing through a crucible of suffering that defied simple description or easy comprehension. Because this experience was so outside the ken of their experience, the ken of contemporary life, most doubted that anyone, even veterans of war, who had not experienced imprisonment, could ever fully understand the horrors of the prison camps. Many prisoners lamented that they lacked sufficient skills, sufficient craft, to render into words the full reality of their experience. Nor did many prisoners have knowledge of the historical evolution of captivity that would have enabled them to recognize the trials that they were undergoing were indeed unprecedented. Throughout much of recorded history, captors performed a simple calculation. Were prisoners of war best alive and exploited in some fashion, or were they better off dead? Prior to the 18th century, almost no armies had any interest, let alone any meaningful capacity, to take responsibility of harboring prisoners of war, certainly not for extended periods of time. So to escape these to escape these complications, combatants from ancient Egypt to medieval Europeans typically massacred, enslaved, or ransomed their prisoners. And so, coming down from top, you'll see I've identified what these are, but at the top is those are to be ransomed at the top. Those are enslaved, and down here is the slaughter by the English of the French at Agincourt. So those are the three examples. You massacre them, you enslave them, or you ransom them. With increasing zeal after the 17th century, jurists and intellectuals in early modern Europe sought to tame war by reforming these practices. To that end, they advocated that warfare should be waged exclusively by states and by professional armies, rather than as an extension of private grievances. Hugo Grotius, the 17th century's foremost authority on international law, urged states to abide by formal treaties, by formal rules of warfare, including regarding prisoners of war. captives he proposed should no longer be treated as private property of their captors. Along with women, children, clergy, and the elderly, prisoners should be protected from the horrors of unbounded war. Emir Vattel, Grotius' successor as the preeminent interpreter of international law, refined these precepts. Combatants, he proclaimed, were enemies only so long as they were, quote, waging war. As soon as your enemy has laid down his arms and surrendered his body, you have no longer any right over his life. So they weren't supposed to be enslaved, they weren't supposed to be ransomed anymore, and they weren't supposed to be slaughtered anymore. By the middle of the 18th century, many commanders, early modern European commanders, had at least a rudimentary familiarity with these ascendant laws of war. And all European powers felt the need to justify their conduct by reference to them. The treatment of prisoners of war became a conspicuous measure by which a nation demonstrated its ascent of the ladder of civilization. To treat enemy soldiers as well or better than one's own was to secure the moral high ground, while simultaneously encouraging the enemy to reciprocate humane treatment of its captives. Triumphant armies during the 18th century typically either released prisoners on parole or held them for what were called prisoner exchanges. If the captives agreed to formal terms with their captors, the prisoners usually released with an understanding that they wouldn't fight again during the present campaign season. So it was an oath of honor that I won't fight if you let me go. Those who surrendered without formal terms often were retained until they joined their captor's army, so you switched sides, or you exchanged for prisoners held by the enemy. Now, I want to acknowledge openly that rank and file prisoners awaiting exchange in the early modern era endured sometimes dismal conditions. They were consigned to ramshackle, catch-all facilities ranging from derelict churches, stables, barns, castles, mansions, barracks, hospitals, and decommissioned ships. Captive officers, however, were typically granted parole in a location determined by their captor. This privilege, in effect, turned each paroled officer into his own prison guard. After signing a parole certificate, prisoners received a letter of protection, and they traveled on their own to a designated parole town. On reaching their destination, they were free to circulate within a stipulated range of miles or distance. They were supplied with the subsistence money proportional to their military rank, and they were responsible for securing their own lodging and sustenance. Once settled, paroled prisoners often blended into their host communities. French prisoners held in Britain during the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, displayed impressive habits of industry. In addition to engaging in a broad range of artisanal crafts, and I didn't show these because it's not really relevant to what we're talking about, but French soldiers in particular made extraordinarily exquisite carvings out of wood and bone, and very, very intricate, large carvings. In any case, they engaged in a range of artisanal crafts, and they offered instruction. So you have French prisoners of war in England and Scotland offering instruction in dancing, music, drawing, and languages. They opened theater companies, they opened cafes, they opened billiard rooms and clubs that catered to both prisoners and the local community. Meanwhile, British prisoners paroled in Verdun in France went to horse races, joined subscription lending libraries, and patronized brothels. Parole, in theory, was a temporary status for prisoners until they were exchanged with the enemy. With increasing regularity, early modern warring states entered into so-called cartels that specified how prisoners of war would be treated, paroled, and exchanged. Ideally, the exchanges were general. The two sides would exchange all the soldiers they had, all the prisoners they had. at one time. But to address the inevitable imbalances in the number of prisoners held by the respective sides, combatants typically agreed to quotas to redeem prisoners of different ranks. Thus, a general might be exchanged for so many colonels and a lieutenant for so many common soldiers. For instance, when British General John Burgoyne was captured during the American Revolution, the Americans exchanged him for 1,047 prisoners, privates. So that was 1 to 1,000. That's a good deal, although you can see generals are worth a whole lot more than privates. With the founding of the American Republic, American revolutionaries immediately adopted these conventions regarding war and prisoners. General George Washington pledged to demonstrate that the fledgling nation was as civilized as the sovereign state of Great Britain. The British, however, dismissed Washington's gesture, contending that the American colonists in arms were traitors, to whom the British had no obligation to grant protections customarily accorded to legitimate combatants. Consequently, British avoided routine exchanges while subjecting American captives to harsh internment in abandoned ship hulls, mines, and other decrepit facilities. And their treatment was notorious. Became part of a Revolutionary War American memory. When the United States and British next clashed during the War of 1812, British authorities conceded this time that Americans were genuine combatants and entered into an exchange cartel to swap prisoners. The exchange regime promoted norms across national boundaries, providing protections, especially for officers, against some of the potential hardships of imprisonment. In the experience of Winfield Scott, whose military career extended from the War of 1812 to the Civil War, is illustrative. Scott was captured during a battle near Niagara Falls in 1813. His British captors held him until he could be swapped for an officer of equal rank. During his captivity, he dined with British officers. He enjoyed the privilege of strolling without guards, and he had access to books and other creature comforts. Within 6 weeks of his capture, the British had paroled him, and within 3 months of his capture, he was back in the field. He had been returned to his command. His treatment was in complete accord with the conventions of the day. In most regards, the conditions of imprisonment were indistinguishable from those that he would have enjoyed had he not been a captive. He underwent negligible humiliation, negligible degradation, and no cruelty. During the Mexican War, from 1846 to 1848, Scott was then the commander of the American forces in Mexico, and he oversaw similar exchange protocols for thousands of captured Mexican soldiers. The prisoner of war experience that I've been describing here, the antecedents to what came in the Civil War, was not without suffering, despair, cruelty. But in essential regards, the experience differed markedly from that of the Civil War and all subsequent conflicts. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, both Union and Confederate authorities assumed that prisoners of war would be handled as they had been handled during the War of 1812 or the Mexican War. Neither side anticipated building extensive facilities, certainly not for the long-term warehousing of prisoners. They had no experience doing that. Instead, they looked to the exchange of prisoners on the battlefield to ease the burden of housing and maintaining prisoners of war. But I just want to outline here, before getting further in subsequent lectures, the experience that I'm describing here, why it is that that didn't come to pass. But because the Lincoln administration was loath to negotiate with rebels, no general system of formal exchanges would be established until a full year after the firing on Fort Sumter. To negotiate an exchange, Lincoln feared, could be construed as extending recognition to the Confederacy. Instead, Union officials responded exactly as British officials had responded to the American revolutionaries 3/4 of a century earlier. That is, they regarded Confederates as lawless rebels who should not be accorded legal standing of legitimate combatants. But by the spring of 1862, the Lincoln administration recognized that its policy was untenable. By that point, the Confederacy already had tens of thousands of Union prisoners, and both the family members at home and the prisoners in the camps were not content to remain in that state without protesting to the north or to the south, vice versa. So by the spring of 1861, the Lincoln administration recognized that it had to change its policy. After persuading themselves that prisoner exchanges did not imply formal recognition of the Confederacy, Union officials reached an agreement with their Confederate counterparts in July of 1862. And formal prisoner exchanges took place from July, really starting in August of 1862 on through the fall of 1862. And as they had been in 1812, prisoners were exchanged according to rank, colonel for colonel, sergeant for sergeant, or a sergeant for so many corporals or so many privates. In accordance with the European traditions, a prisoner who was paroled promised not to fight again until his name had been exchanged for that of a man of a similar rank. So in other words, you could be paroled and sent back to the Confederacy or back to the Union, and then you would wait until you were notified that you had been formally exchanged, and then you went back into ranks. That's how it was supposed to work. So following the exchange, the two prisoners could take up arms again and rejoin their respective armies. Both sides, in other words, kept running tallies of paroled and exchanged prisoners and sought to keep the balances even. While this system of exchanges and paroles ensured that the prisoner of war populations didn't balloon out of control in the fall of 1862, it was beset with problems. It worked best when rough parity in the number of prisoners held by both sides motivated authorities to hasten exchanges. Otherwise, the urgency of each side tended to vary according to the relative burden each side bore. So in other words, when the Union had more Confederate prisoners than the Confederacy had Union prisoners, the Union Army wasn't so keen to exchange, and vice versa. So intricate were the balance sheets inherent in this system that differences of interpretation and tabulation routinely arose, and they escalated to matters of principle. Nonetheless, the exchange system might have sputtered along had controversy over the status of African American prisoners of war not flared up. When it did, the question of prisoners of war became inextricably tied to the most fundamental issues at stake for each side. Following the Emancipation Proclamation and the recruitment of African Americans to join the Union Army in 1863, Confederate authorities furiously denounced the Union Army for promoting servile insurrection. Confederates pledged to execute white Union officers who commanded black troops and to return former slaves serving in the Union Army to their previous owners. They were adamant that black prisoners would not be exchanged. With equal fervor, starting in July of 1863, the Lincoln administration insisted that black prisoners of war must be treated like all other captives. To exclude black prisoners from the exchange policy would have condoned the Confederate policy of re-enslavement and made a mockery of the Union's professed principles. Thus, precisely at the same moment that the war intensified, in 1863, the exchange system ground to a halt. Most soldiers captured in the spring of 1863 remained prisoners until the end of the war. Prisoner of war populations in both the Union and the Confederacy exploded, ensuring that custodial imprisonment on a massive scale would prevail until either side blinked. Without fanfare or public debate on either side of the Union and the Confederacy, Americans launched a vast experiment in mass incarceration. I'm checking with time. What time do they need to get out right now? 15 minutes, good. Well, then I ended up at the right place. So 50 minutes, we stop right here, right? Yep. All right.
Thank you. In order to honor the exchange between class, we're going to dismiss you without question and answer. Please come back tonight at 6 o'clock for the second of the lectures about encampment imprisonment, and we will have a question and answer period at that time. Thank you.
I have read lynching, and it's always been a fascination to me.
Well, thank you.
What we can do in the book is wonderful. I enjoyed today as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Hopefully I will see you again tonight.
Great, great.
As someone of somewhat questionable English